Let's talk about some of the wildest moments of NFL Week 14 and look ahead to the fantasy football playoffs. That is what we're doing today on RotoViz Overtime. Shawn, Week 14, we've had a lot of good weeks, I have to say, this season. Last season at times felt like a real, you were fighting uphill all the time, trying to drag yourself through these games. This season, there's been, and every week there's been some bad games. Let's not fool ourselves, but there's been some real fireworks, I guess we could call it. Some players hitting massive scores we'll talk about on today's show. And then you get into things like, FFPC Championship finals, and you're chasing down some of those. So we might even talk about our team as we work through that today to see how it is ahead of Monday Night Football, each team in that environment. Shawn, for us, still one player left to go, both of those on the Bengals. So we'll touch on that later on. This was pretty wild. I know Shawn wants to vent a little bit to kick this one off. And the reason for that is, Shawn, the Packers played against the Lions on Thursday football. The Packers coming up, I would say, just a little bit short against one of the best teams in the NFL, but we'll let Shawn color in the lines and tell us the story of Thursday Night Football. Shawn, what happened?
Well, Colm, what happened was that evidently the Green Bay Packers, A, don't have the scouting report, B, don't like football. That's the only explanation I can come up with for a team that is averaging over 10 yards per pass, even without including Jayden Reed in the game plan, and instead decides to give 18 carries to Josh Jacobs. Somehow Jacobs averages 3.7 yards per carry against a Detroit Lions defense that has been ravaged by injuries. The Lions here sell out against the run, limit these Packers possessions, hold them to key field goals. This game column had a little bit of a sense that Matt LaFleur doesn't like football, but does have Josh Jacobs on his fantasy team. I don't know. As the Packers here, I think you have to win against this version of the Lions that has so many injuries. You certainly have to win when Jared Goff comes out to start the second half and throws that pick. You certainly have to win when the Lions go for it in their own side, as they should have, but get stopped. You have all of those short fields to work with. You do score 31 points, but you know you're playing against this Detroit offensive juggernaut. Colm, the Packers right now are a team that plays, I guess, just to get through the game, right? I mean, they're 9-4. They're a good team. They have a lot of good players. There were some additional opportunities in this game where Jordan Love has some guys running free, doesn't pull the trigger. A lot of this obviously is colored a bit by fantasy football frustration. I know a lot of listeners will already know that Ben and I were playing Jayden Reed. Actually had Jordan Addison on the bench, so that was a great feeling with it. But the Jordan Reed versus Josh Jacobs battle, we lose that one 24-0. But you also lose as a team. And Colm, one of the things we've been talking about with your Packers for a month now is that Josh Jacobs has been increasingly unsuccessful as a runner because the Packers are so predictable, that the Packers, when they needed to pass, were not going to have that. You've been saying that you think that Jayden Reed is injured. I guess I'm a little bit more open to that after a game like this. Now, obviously, the previous week he scores 2 touchdowns, but isn't actually that involved that week either. I don't know what to make of what the Packers are doing right now, in that they have a fantastic defense, but the defense doesn't come through. They have incredible pieces on offense, but the offense doesn't come through in the big moments. And they let the Lions dominate the tactical decisions, including down the stretch, to win this game. This is a huge missed opportunity, I think, for Green Bay. And you look at what they're doing, where they've lost confidence in Jordan Love. I mean, you had a guy who, over the second half of last season, was the best quarterback in the NFL. He looks like he's on the verge of an MVP type of season this year. You've taken a big step back organizationally by undercutting him and running your offense through a running back.
I'm not going to argue that they are overusing Josh Jacobs in the running back position. I do think there's a lot of this that's, when we get 8 weeks down the line and we get into the playoffs, I think this Packers team will be live in the playoffs. I think there's a lot of truth to leaving plays on the field. We've talked, I don't know how many times this season, about drops on this offense. That wasn't really the issue this week, but we did have a nice catch early in the game by Christian Watson, which was then fumbled as he kind of approaches midfield. That was the Packers' only turnover of the game, but that obviously is not a great way to start things off, leading to a touchdown. You mentioned the Jared Goff one. The Packers get a touchdown of that. So pretty even on the turnovers and what came off it. The area, Shawn, that was a big difference in this game, I do think, is the fourth down conversions and how things went there. 2 off the Lions touchdowns, I believe it was, came on fourth down plays where they were aggressive, they went for it. That's one of the things I've thought for the Packers for quite some time, is sometimes when not necessarily this game, but when they're in those situations, not as aggressive and trying to make sure you get 7 rather than coming away with the 3 points. So there is some of the coaching elements there that I think can be nitpicked. I also think that Matt LaFleur is one of the best coaches in the NFL. I think it's a case of when we're talking about the 49ers and things don't go good for them, it obviously went very good in week 14, but it's he's still Kyle Shanahan's still a very good coach. So I think it's in that kind of realm of things when it comes to him. And I think that they will get back to Jordan Love in this offense. And I think also that we maybe underplay some of the impact that not having Romeo Doubs has on this offense, just for the structural elements. Jayden Reed, Shawn, you mentioned I thought he was injured. I thought that we were starting to round into the healthy portion of Jayden Reed. So I do not know what happened here with 1 target, no receptions. That was obviously disastrous for him. Christian Watson ends up with 114 yards. But I think the aggressiveness of the Lions and Dan Campbell was positive. I think the home field advantage, the crowd there in Detroit were very, very into this one, very loud. I also think that they shouldn't, and I wanted them to kick a field goal at that point to see if the Packers could then tie it up, but they should not have went for that fourth down where they eventually kicked the field goal. That was a little bit risky. We've seen this a few times this week, Shawn. You've seen quarterbacks, getting stood on by their offensive lineman's foot and so on, slipping down, falling over. That almost cost the Lions at that particular moment if they hadn't converted that fourth down. So I just think the Lions are a really good team, even with the defensive injuries. I also think there was some questionable officiating decisions in this one, but we won't just get into that.
You weren't that happy with a play late that I guess I don't remember. I am trying to wipe these Josh Jacobs plays from my memory. Certainly.
Yeah, I was telling Shawn that Josh Jacobs almost had another touchdown, which he wasn't best pleased about. The Packers settled for a field goal late in the fourth quarter where they would have taken the lead. They kicked that field goal with 3:38 left in the fourth quarter. Sorry, they're at the Detroit 14. But prior to that, we do get a situation where it's a pass from Jordan Love to Josh Jacobs for 6 yards. Christian Watson gets called for a pick play on offensive pass interference. I think it was really, really soft. I think it was a US people called a flop. In Europe, we would call that in soccer a dive. But I think it was very, very, very soft. That was overturned and they settled for the field goal. It was 4th and goal from the 14. So I know when I'm talking about some of these situations, when they kick the field goal, I think it probably makes sense to take it in that situation. But it was 2nd and goal on that particular play from the Detroit 6. So I think, we're looking at how the game plays out. That was where the Packers tied it up 31-31. They would have had a 4-point advantage at that particular point, which would have meant then when the Lions are making that drive at the end, they would have to get a touchdown to take the win. So again, that's why I'm a bit reluctant to pass too much judgment on this. I actually thought it was a pretty good performance on the road from a Packers team in a tough environment where I think a lot of teams are going to come up short against Detroit.
Well, Colm, you get a lot of exciting things, I think, from the Packers, and that Christian Watson is rounding into a guy who is going to be a star alongside Jayden Reed. You're just going to have so much offensive firepower. You have Tucker Kraft, who catches a touchdown and looks like he is going to be a superstar. All of those things are very positive. I guess I would disagree. I was so excited that the Lions went for it on 4th down on that play. And I feel like Jared Goff getting the handoff to David Montgomery, even he's on the ground, that's probably the play that clinches him NFL MVP. I mean, if you care more about fantasy points, then, maybe it's Josh Allen. But Jared Goff gets the handoff. They're able to run the clock out. They're able to make it an easier field goal. We saw how much difference that can make throughout the weekend, throughout the last month. I mean, you were very derogatory in your comments about the Kansas City Chiefs before we got on the air. They win because they have every necessary inch. When they are kneeling, I'm like, stop giving up yards. Your kicker can shank it more and more every inch you are closer.
Shawn, we'll talk about another one of these, but in the Rams game, they get 2 unsportsmanlike penalties after they score the Josh Allen sneak touchdown near the end of the game. So they end up kicking a 46-yard PAT. So when we're talking about giving up yards, there was a lot of questionable things like that the teams did over this weekend. But we'll save those thoughts, Shawn. I may come back to the KC thoughts. Shawn has gone in hard on my Packers. Maybe I'll have to come back in the other way.
Right. The Green Bay Packers in this game are 1 for 5 on third down, and they do not go for it once, which again, situationally, it doesn't always make sense. The Lions are 7 for 15. They are 4 for 5 on fourth down. They run 31 more plays. Now, you can say that on a per play basis, the Packers were the far better team in this game. And that's, I think, a reasonable takeaway, but also the way the Packers are playing, they're going to consistently get themselves into these situations where you have games like that, where you dominate and your opponent runs 31 more plays. Dan Campbell is coaching in a way where you will be outplayed. And because of what you have done, you will run the 31 more plays. You will win the game. The Lions had some squirrely elements to this game where, I mean, fortunately, we're not playing Amon-Ra St. Brown in my redraft rankings for 2025 last week column. I mentioned that even though he is scoring well this year, I do not have him as a first round pick. This game illustrates why. Tim Patrick with the 2 touchdowns. That's going to be pretty triggering for Jameson Williams, Sean Laporta. That's not his name. That's a good name, though, Colm. Sean Laporta would be fantastic. Sam Laporta, Amon-Ra St. Brown. But Dan Campbell. I mean, Dan Campbell is the NFL MVP. This should be the first time that it goes to an NFL head coach.
Yeah, he's doing a tremendous job. And I mentioned that he shouldn't have went for that. I think statistically, it's one that if you get it wrong, looks extremely bad. Most of the time I'm pushing for coaches to go for it in those situations. We've seen some aggressive play calling, and I hope it continues to spread throughout the league. So shout out to Dan Campbell for getting the W there. But I think I'm much more optimistic on how the game played out for the Packers than Shawn is. So we'll see how it goes in the playoffs when Matt LaFleur is in his bag of tricks and the Packers bounce the Detroit Lions. But Shawn,
when the Packers have been like the number 1 seed, has it gone for them well in the playoffs?
No, it has gone very, very bad. So usually when I am highly optimistic about getting that number 1 seed, usually, obviously in the past, there was the 2 chances to get it. The Packers have consistently squandered that very, very quickly. So hopefully that isn't the case this season for the Lions. But the Packers, even if they won this, it's a long route to getting into the 1 seed. So it wasn't one that was as hurtful, but the Lions cruise control for that division. Minnesota in the same division, Shawn, they are 11-2, and they absolutely rolled over the Atlanta Falcons this week. It was Kirk Cousins' return to face off against his former team, and it didn't really go according to plan. It was a lot closer than the final scoreline looks in terms of how it finished up. We get into the fourth quarter, and Minnesota gets 21 points to 0 in that fourth quarter, which obviously spreads the final score. We get 5 passing touchdowns for Darnold, 347 yards for him. Aaron Jones gets a late touchdown, gets in the end zone, 73 yards, 1 touchdown on the ground. Very concentrated offense, which we like to see in a lot of these situations where we get Jordan Addison, 12 targets, Justin Jefferson gets the 7 targets. He gets 7 receptions, 132 yards, 2 touchdowns. Jordan Addison, 8 for 133 and 3 touchdowns. The other players, Shawn, to mention this, we get Darnell Mooney, 7 targets, 6 receptions, 142. Ray McLeod gets 11 targets. Drake London gets 10 targets on the other side. Kyle Pitts, Shawn, 6 targets, 1 reception, 14. Bijan again goes over 20 fantasy points in PPR formats. Only had the 2 receptions for 9 yards, but has 22 carries, 92 yards, 1 touchdown. Tyler Algier gets in the end zone. He is 9 for 63 on the ground. Ray McLeod did have a fumble on this that led to one off the touchdowns for the Atlanta Falcons. Shawn, looking through this, the biggest thing I probably have to say is we get obviously a huge game from Jordan Addison. He also had a couple of pass interference penalties go against him, which could have made it an even bigger day as he almost comes down with them. But in situations that he got hit, one of those leading to a Justin Jefferson touchdown. Jefferson crossed 7,000 receiving yards in this game, third fastest in NFL history, 73 games. One more game it's taken him than Julio Jones and Lance Allworth. So we know how good he is, continues to do it. Interesting though, Shawn, on Jordan Addison and how he continues to develop. He's had 3 30-point plus games in his NFL career. 2 of those have come in the last 3 weeks. So it's very interesting to look at how this offense is going to develop going forward. TJ Hawkinson had 5 targets, 4 receptions, 45 yards, but he seems to be a long afterthought after those 2 particular guys. But Addison with a monster day, incredible performance. And the final thing I want to mention before we get Shawn's thoughts is on one of these Jefferson touchdowns, Shawn, I have absolutely no worldly idea how the defensive back is trying to track this. It ends up looking like a punt from Darnold that the ball hangs in the air that high. But as it's hanging, the defensive back is stumbling in multiple different directions. And it leads to a reception by Jefferson at the 5-yard line. And then he continues to go on his way. And some of the Atlanta, and we had talked about this prior to the weekend with the environment that Jordan Addison was set up in this week. So I'm saying about the 2 games of 30 plus points over the last couple of weeks, how much of this is down to just the defensive situation with the Atlanta Falcons, and what are we doing here with the Vikings moving forward? Because both their wide receivers here got all the points that they could really look for in week 14.
Colm, you pull up the wide receiver leaderboard since the beginning of week 9, and it's very, very fun. Puka Nacua up there at the top, not a shock after he puts up 42 points yesterday, which unfortunately, as I mentioned, Ben and I hit that game in a lot of our finals. But then Jordan Addison in the second, Jamar Chase could go into first tonight. I think that he probably will. But then you get Jerry Jeudy, the aforementioned Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Jackson Smith and Jigba. That has been absolutely fantastic for our teams as we pull through with Addison, Jeudy, and JSN, 3 of the strongest targets. Colm, in the tight end category, you have Jonnu just below that. He went on an overtime rampage for us. Probably.
Does it count as overtime when you only turn up for that portion of the game? Is it like regulation for Jonnu?
Well, Colm, I mean, he's looking at the title of the show and saying, this is when I have to deliver for Colm and Shawn. Anyway, you were mentioning the Minnesota Vikings, the Atlanta Falcons. This game makes me even a little bit more frustrated, even though both of my teams that started Justin Herbert last week in situations where the other quarterback scored a lot more points, having a little bit of a hard time understanding where the Chargers were in that one. Now, Ladd McConkey, who sadly was not able to go yesterday, that was a bit of a dagger for a lot of fantasy managers on Sunday night. He had the huge first half. None of the rest of their guys were involved in that game. This Atlanta Falcons defense is very, very poor. Colm, if you've checked out the different tools, Blair's article, all of those things would show you that the Vikings were set to go off like this. This was one of the reasons that beyond just, you don't really want to start Jalen Waddle or Xavier Worthy with your season on the line. Now, Jalen Waddle did come through. That's exciting for us if we do make the sprint. But in the first wave, as we are battling to get into the sprint to win a main event championship, every single one of these points. Colm, Jordan Addison arguably scores another touchdown. I desperately wanted them to challenge. Now, the problem is that it probably, based on the angles they showed, it was going to be difficult to overturn, but he does appear to have the ball over the goal line on a previous reception as well, where he is not ruled in. Addison now seems very clearly to have been pretty compromised early in the season with those 2 ankle injuries when he was not going off. This is the season that we talked about. This is the season that we drafted. when you have a game against a porous secondary like the Falcons, you have a great matchup. You are Minnesota and you're chasing the Detroit Lions. I mean, for me, and again, these are two very different opponents. You can't say that a game against the Lions and a game against the Falcons are remotely similar, other than they're NFL teams, and NFL teams have a lot of talent, and on any given Sunday can cause you some problems. But the Vikings in this one, they go out, they destroy the Falcons through the air. You get those combined 5 touchdowns. This is a team who understands who their playmakers are. As you mentioned, a very concentrated offense. I think Kevin O'Connell is another one of these guys where if you look at the best coaches in the NFL season, in this NFL season, I think you have Dan Campbell pretty easily at number 1. You have Kevin O'Connell pretty easily at number 2. I don't know that there is a third option really in there. Colm, who am I missing in that conversation to start with? And then, I mean, do you think that we can expect more of this from Addison going forward? Because again, Justin Jefferson may be like a more well-rounded version of Randy Moss. He may be a more dynamic version of Jerry Rice. I mean, both of those things are borderline blasphemy to even consider, much less to utter. But what Jefferson is doing, and doing in a context where you have Sam Darnold, who is very limited. That's the other thing you have to keep in mind here. There's still plenty of plays in this game where Sam Darnold's lack of pocket presence and just general flusterability leads you to scream at the TV set. And yet he puts up a monster day because he has a head coach who knows what he's doing and because his playmakers are out of this world.
Yeah, I think O'Connell is absolutely tremendous. And you mentioned, like, I joked about that play to Jefferson, that touchdown, but like if you watch the isolated view on Jefferson, like he's running down the field with one hand in the air, saying like, I'm open. And I think he had it in the air for, I would say, 40 yards before the ball comes, which then I mentioned is like, looks almost the trajectory of a punt. So if this defensive back doesn't fall over, that goes likely as an incomplete pass, maybe even an interception. And that is where
one of Jordan Addison's touchdowns is a punt that he goes back and gets because it's so far short, and the defenders fall down because they were expecting a pass in the vicinity of Jordan Addison. And he's like, no, this pass is 10 yards upfield. I got to go back and get it.
So there is things like that happening. You asked about the coaches, Shawn. I think Matt LaFleur is in that conversation. I think Kyle Shanahan is in that conversation. And this week,
but for 20, I mean, Kyle Shanahan's been a disaster in 2024.
Yeah, this season. I think that like he's working with a little bit of a tougher offensive situation based on the injuries to Cooper Kupp and to Puka Nacua. But I think that Sean McVay has done a strong job in that. They are 7-6, which isn't tremendous, but I think a head coach that is doing a lot under an environment that isn't perfect. The Vikings, Shawn, come up next against the Bears, who this week obviously got whipped up on really badly by the 49ers. So I think we can touch on this game and run through it a little bit and do it pretty quickly. We start off, and Brock Purdy, Shawn, they're popping up the numbers on the screen as the game's going along. The first quarter, second quarter, as it's going down, and it's a situation where you're like, these numbers are tremendous. We start off, we get Guerendo with a 23-yard reception to kick things off, and then we get George Kittle for a 33-yard reception. That leads to a Jennings TD. We get then a very similar drive shortly after where we get a 20-yard reception to Guerendo that got him to the 1-yard line. But prior to that, we had a 31-yard completion to George Kittle. So the two of those guys started off very hot. Purdy got a little bit lucky on a tip pass that ended up being a Jennings reception, but he had 152 yards passing, Shawn, in the first quarter. I thought some of the play calling was awesome in this opening, I would say half. I think they really could cool it down once they got to halftime. It's 24-0 at the half. There's stats. I'm on about the stats coming up for the 49ers. There was nothing happening here in the first half at all for the Chicago Bears. We get Caleb Williams finishes up with 134 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, takes 7 sacks for 46 yards in this one. DeAndre Swift, 14 carries for 38. DJ Moore ends up kind of leading the way for that offense in yards. It's 49 yards and 6 receptions. Adunze, though, does get 2 receiving touchdowns, 4 for 42, 2 touchdowns. I thought a lot of this, and it obviously counts for fantasy, a lot of it garbage time related if we're looking at it from that perspective. The 49ers were in cruise control, but the big talking point is obviously the performance of Isaac Guerendo. 15 carries for 78, 2 rushing touchdowns. also has 2 receptions for 50 yards. Shawn, we talked about it as well, Deebo Samuel, and how he's been used in this offense prior to this game. He has 5 carries for 13, but he has 2 receptions for 22 on 3 targets. Again, it's concerning at how his performance has been this season as we move forward. George Kittle, those 6 receptions, 151 on 6 targets. George Kittle, Shawn, we love our tight ends here. We love Trey McBride, love Brock Bowers, love all the different options. George Kittle might be the most fun to watch when he has the ball in his hands, because he just wants to hit somebody, it feels like, when he gets it. We also get Jauan Jennings, 8 targets, 7 receptions, 90 yards, 2 touchdowns. And it really felt like they could have had much, much more if they wanted to push it on forward. What did you think here of this game? Was this just a complete mismatch? And again, it kind of sets you up for an appetizer as to what to expect from the Vikings as they face off against this Bears team in Week 15.
Yeah, this was a strange one for me when you think about the overall environment, because you have Eberflus getting fired because his offensive coordinator and quarterback couldn't get plays in and couldn't get plays off down the stretch of their previous game. The coordinator, who was probably the main culprit in that meltdown, ends up then, because his defensive-minded head coach has been fired, because the incompetent offensive coordinator has been fired, he rises to a point where now, despite no real demonstrated competency on his own part, is the head coach of the Chicago Bears. That seemed to be catastrophic in this one, in that the defense, which has been pretty salty most of the season, and has put them in a position to where if a couple of close games go the other direction, then you and I have been obviously debating / having a good time with what the Chiefs are doing in 1-score games. The Vikings do win going away in this one, but what they have been doing in 1-score games. The Bears, on the other side of that, a much better team than their record would indicate, and a team that did need to start over with their coaching staff, but this was arguably a weird time to do it. They were a train wreck in this one. As you mentioned, they put up absolutely no, not even a little hurdle on defense here, as the 49ers could have scored 60. It really seemed like when Brandon Allen went in on some teams where we've got Purdy going, you're like, you guys would always use Christian McCaffrey at the end of blowouts. Why are you protecting Brock Purdy now? We finally learned our lessons, even though that was not when McCaffrey got hurt, obviously. I think it's very exciting for Isaac Guerendo. We did a pretty glowing show on him late last week. He demonstrates that speed that we were talking about, with a 30-yard rushing score, with a 27-yard receiving score. He only gets the 2 receptions, but they go for 50 yards. Colm, this is the big play guy that this offense arguably needed. He certainly is not nearly as skilled or as athletic, really, even with the freak score and whatnot that he got at the combine, as Christian McCaffrey. He's not the bulldozer that Jordan Mason is, but he's the big play guy. And anybody who's watched any Saquon Barkley this year understands the value of big plays in the running game. That contrasts with teams that want to, hand off 30 times to their guy who has to break 5 tackles to gain 3 yards. I'd love to see this explosiveness. You mentioned George Kittle. He's absolutely fantastic. I would say that Brock Bowers after the catch, also spectacular. The Trey McBride after the catch, pretty unreal.
They just don't have the flowing hair, though.
No, they don't. They don't. I mean, you got to give George Kittle the hair battle, the Viking battle, pretty easily there. Now, I mean, Trey McBride, it sounded like he was the NFL Man of the Year nominee from the Cardinals. I think that has to make you love him even more, especially in contrast to maybe some of the things we're getting from Brock Bowers. But I mean, Kittle, he's another guy who's tricky. When I published the redraft rankings a week ago today, I asked Blair if there's anybody that I had left out that I shouldn't. And his main comment was George Kittle. And that one's just always so tricky. When you look at what the target share is likely to be, even in an electric offense, There are other players there. Colm, watching this game was fun. Receiver hasn't necessarily been our strength through the bulk of the year, but our two starters, Jauan Jennings and Jordan Addison, go for 67 points. When you're talking about bad luck in some other places, I think you got to go back and look at the 67 that these two guys put up and be like, this was a good time for Jennings and Addison to have combined for 67. That was so much fun. The 49ers do still appear to be in a lost season, although the NFC West is one of those divisions where anything is still possible. That becomes a little bit less the case with a game that we'll talk about coming up with the Seattle Seahawks, who I might put their head coach in the number 3 spot for the 2024 season when you consider where they were, where they started, where they're going now. But this is a big game for the 49ers, and they have to be so excited about Guerendo. They've made a lot of bad selections. I was joking with some people yesterday morning that, and it was kind of in the context of Will Levis, right? Because Will Levis was a horrible college quarterback. Ask Stephon Leco, who has done all of the fantastic college football work for us. One of his last articles on the site was how you absolutely cannot use any of your rookie assets to add Will Levis to your roster. That article, I mean, you don't have too many articles that pop into your head like 3 or 4 times every single Sunday, but that is the case when you're watching Will Levis. The 49ers drafted a wide receiver in the first round who was not a good college football player. They do that a lot. That doesn't mean that Ricky Pearsall won't eventually be a good pro. He is somebody who disappeared in this game and hasn't been much of a factor during the season, even though they have needed that. Now, again, he went into the season with some very unfortunate health issues that he has, at this point, apparently been able to overcome. So that's obviously a very feel-good story. There are extenuating circumstances. He doesn't look like a good pick. I think that Guerendo gets colored in some of the same way with the kind of broad brush, what have you. Guerendo, I think, is going to be one of their mid-round picks. If you only let the 49ers and the Rams pick in round, if you only let those two teams pick on day 3, they would be very, very good teams.
Let's do a couple of games, Shawn, that I'm hoping this one's going to be rapid fire. You've mentioned Will Levis. This was not a good, there is games where there is, I think, good fantasy scoring games from Will Levis. This was not a good game in either regard. We did start him in our main event, so when we're talking through some of the players, the 8.7 points that he put up, we really needed those wide receiver points, Shawn, to help stand us a little bit off a chance when your quarterback does that. This game was mismanaged by both teams throughout. We get Mac Jones at quarterback for the Jaguars, obviously with the injured Trevor Lawrence. He has 2 interceptions in this one. We've no interceptions from Will Levis. We do have a fumble, but it is recovered by his own team. Shawn, Tony Pollard looked pretty good. He has 21 carries for 102 yards. It felt like that both teams just wanted this game to be over as quickly as possible, get that clock ran out. But we do have Calvin Ridley, 7 for 59. He did have a play at the end of this one where they're in 3rd down. They're down in the red zone. The pass to him wasn't great. The angle he's running at wasn't going to be that easy to get the extra couple of yards for the first down, but he kind of runs over the sideline. And I think when he does it, he realizes like, oh, that was a bad idea. So they end up going for it in 4th down. They don't get it. They lose the game. Nick Westbrook-Akine, we've mentioned him on a few shows recently. He's been getting touchdown after touchdown after touchdown. He had 2 targets for 1 reception, 19 yards this week. One play that I did think, Shawn, that I was going to highlight was Chig Okonkwo has 4 targets and has 3 receptions for 8 yards. There is one play where Levis does, throw it for a contested catch at the back of the end zone. But Okonkwo on that play has broken completely free on a play action play. I just think he doesn't see him. It's like if it was Trey McBride, we'd be giving out about Kyler Murray overthrowing it. He throws it to a contested catch where Okonkwo was wide open there for a score. Both teams, though, had their struggles towards it. But the player, again, to highlight, I think, in this one is Brian Thomas Jr. He gets 12 targets, 8 receptions for 86, continues a strong rookie year. Shawn, anything here that stood out for you in general? This was a bad football game.
Yeah, this is way up there in the battle for worst NFL games of all time. And within the last couple of seasons where we've had some offensive debacles, that is probably saying something. You watch this game, it's very clear that Mac Jones is a far better quarterback than Will Levis and Drew Lock. At one point, I thought that Drew Lock was playing the worst game at quarterback that I'd ever seen.
Oh my goodness!
But
He started 0 of 8 in that one, but we might even sneak that in as a quick hitter before the end here.
And yet, in the middle of the fourth quarter here, Will Levis passes. Will Levis was somehow worse in this game than Drew Lock was in the Giants game. Colm, the first drive, so the explanation for Mason Rudolph, who is not going to lead you to the Super Bowl, but is a far, far, far better quarterback than Will Levis, is simply that this is a lost season for the Titans, and they have to see what they have with Will Levis. The first 8 plays of this game were runs. They had a field goal drive to start where they handed off 9 out of 10 times. I think the coaching staff would probably make the argument that if we had handed off on 90% of the plays on every drive, we would have won this game. And you probably would have. Now, Tony Pollard would have gotten pretty tired. But if the whole point is that you want to evaluate Will Levis, then you need to call the game plan in a way that you're going to evaluate Will Levis. This is a team that more or less said, we don't want Derrick Henry anymore. And then in week 14, the first 8 plays of the game were running plays. As you mentioned, Tony Pollard did look pretty good. Because
Shawn, the other note I wanted to mention in this is when you're trying to evaluate a quarterback and, there's like maybe 2 seconds left at the end of the first half, do you want to have him go out there and like attempt a Hail Mary throw and get just absolutely crushed? Is that another way to evaluate it?
I mean, one of the things is that Will Levis has the worst pocket presence of any quarterback who's ever played. He's going to get crushed on plays, right? There's no way around it if you have no sense of where the other players on the field are. The play that really, I think, defined the game, has defined the Titans season, and certainly should, end this quarterback experiment for all time, was the third drive. So this is a game that doesn't feature that many, certainly first half possessions, when you have that original drive where they run the ball every time. Then they have a 3-and-out, and then they have a 15-play, 90-yard drive where they turn it over on downs. They do go for it on 4th and goal from the 2, which you like to see. Colm, we did the extended skit where Kyler Murray and the Trey McBride play, and you mentioned that if it had been Kyler Murray missing Trey McBride, make a big deal of it. This was like one-upping that. On this 4th and goal play, they ended up having 2 receiving options leak out to the same side. The defensive back goes with the deeper target. The underneath target.
Yeah, this is the Chigaquanko play. This is the one I mentioned.
I don't think I'm not sure I've ever seen anything like it in that. So with the Trey McBride thing, that Trey McBride is the play. You know what the play is as the quarterback, and no one goes with him. And Kyler Murray, who can't see over the offensive line, doesn't see it. He does the whole whirl. This play is one where everything happens right in Will Levis' line of sight. And so every given Sunday, Colm, we have guys who break open where there's a broken coverage and the quarterback doesn't throw them the ball because that's not where the read is. And so, yeah, you'd love for the quarterback to have anticipated maybe that the coverage wasn't going to work, or read it differently, gotten off his early read and thrown to the person who's going to score a 60-70-yard touchdown. That's not necessarily realistic. On this play, the guy who was uncovered is directly in line with the target that he did throw the ball to. And he threw a very poor pass to the guy who was covered. So you could have thrown an accurate pass to the guy who was covered. Ball is probably going to be knocked. Again, I think at that point, you probably could have benched Will Levis and you win this game pretty easily because, again, your backup quarterback is fine. He's not great. He's better than anything the Las Vegas Raiders have run out there this season. The Jaguars, is an all-time great matchup. I mean, that's the other part of this. The Jaguars are historically bad on defense. I think they were something like 2-17 in their last 19 games coming into this one. Their pass defense is one of the worst of all time. The Chicago Bears have done some very poor things. Eberflus did deserve to be fired. I don't understand how the Tennessee Titans have stuck with this coaching staff. There was no excuse for them still to be out there coaching in this game.
That play that you mentioned as well, and to give Tony Pollard credit, he did have a rushing touchdown on that set of downs where it went to fourth down, but it was called back for a holding penalty. Shawn, I believe the holding penalty was on our boy, Tyler Boyd, but it was a situation where just they got so stuck down in the red zone and really couldn't do anything in this entire contest. Another team, Shawn, who were stuck the whole game, but then almost got this game to overtime was the New York Giants. Drew Lock, Shawn, 21 of 49, one interception, 227 passing yards, does a 59 rushing yards on 5 carries. Tyrone Tracy, 16 for 45, gets a touchdown where I do like the extradited replays, the quick replay system. This is one where everyone on the field is like, why are you not letting us run the next play? And they're like, Tyrone Tracy was in for a touchdown on that last play, so let's just kick a PAT. So it is beneficial in that way, but that was how that one played out. We get 10 targets for Neighbors, 5 for 79. Not a lot to talk about throughout the rest of the offense. Tracy did build up his day, though, 5 for 38 on 10 targets for him. The other unfortunate note coming out is Derek Carr looks to have broken his wrist late in this game, tries to hurdle over by the sideline, comes down hard on it. Jake Haener did come in, but he did not throw a pass then after the point that he came in. Jauan Johnson had a nice touchdown on a 30-yard completion. Another game, Shawn, where this game was dreadfully poor in terms of, an NFL game.
Yeah, I love Derek Carr. I think he's undervalued. I say that probably too often because he's probably just, very mediocre. You love to see the effort here. It probably doesn't really make sense in context. The only thing that the Saints are really hoping to get out of the season is some health for their key players. But it was an amazing effort. And, Baker Mayfield has certainly developed himself a cult following. He has fired up and really gotten a poor Tampa Bay Buccaneers team to believe and to be competitive. Again, it's in the NFC South, so it's kind of a little column A, column B type of deal. But you love to see these NFC South teams really competing, even in seasons where they're not going to accomplish anything. That the NFC South has been fun in a way that the AFC South certainly is not. We got a Kendre Miller touchdown in this game. Wasn't really on him. This is one of those rugby plays where he somehow manages to get in. I mean, he was way out when the whole scrum started, and he does get.
I also can't figure out where is the line for the officials to decide, like, okay, forward progress is stopped now, or like, let's give them 4 more seconds to see if they eventually move forward. Now, that play wasn't as bad of a version of it, but I've seen over the last couple of weeks where there's times where like it's playing and you're like, somebody's going to end up getting hurt, as we go through these kind of issues. Like there's sometimes the running backs like caught around the legs and somebody ends pushing them over from in front. But it's like, we should have some sort of consistent method for the forward progress.
Yeah, and it seems very clear cut that offensive players should not be able to push on the back of other offensive players in any context. I think we would have gotten rid of that if not for the situation with Jalen Hurts, where the NFL doesn't want to do something that looks like it's targeted at one player and one team. You can certainly understand that. I kind of like the fact that they're not targeting.
Shawn. That could be 2 teams now because Josh Allen has taken that play for himself.
Josh Allen. Yeah. So, I mean, the thing that you love to see in this is just the competitive spirit. And I mean, Drew Lock is like a poor man's Anthony Richardson from a passing accuracy perspective, but he competes. And that's something we've said about Will Levis. I think that's the most disappointing thing about where Levis is right now, is just that the offense is so broken and he's so limited as an NFL quarterback that his competitiveness, his athleticism doesn't really play up because the overall context just doesn't allow any of that. In this game, you mentioned the 59 rushing yards from Drew Lock. That was cool to see. He went through a stretch in this game where he was throwing the worst passes that have ever occurred on an NFL field, and yet he ends up throwing for 227 yards and leads his team to what should have been overtime, and you certainly feel like they would have won if they had gone to overtime. I think, when we're accurately and justifiably criticizing a team and a player for the weaknesses, it's important to also just be excited about seeing humanity strive for things. And granted, striving in sports is not maybe the pinnacle, and yet this was fun. And Drew Lock played fun football. When you throw 49 times and only complete 21 passes, yeah, there are some things going on that probably aren't perfect, but he played hard. Tyrone Tracy had some brutal drops, and yet he fights for that touchdown. He ends up with a great fantasy day. Great. He scored 19 points. That was 5 more than Saquon Barkley. Again, we go right back to this issue with Barkley where maybe Saquon Barkley is the NFL MVP, and yet because of the lack of high-value touches, he's got to have extraordinary games just to score more points than Tyrone Tracy, which, basically he's had an extraordinary game,
every game.
70% of the games. And that's why he's having a historic season. This one was a silly game, Colm. I did watch through it because I have so much Tyrone Tracy. Anybody who doesn't have a lot of Tyrone Tracy doesn't need to go back and watch the shortcuts of this game, unless you want to see some Drew Lock theatrics, because there was a lot of peak Drew Lock going on in this game.
As we get ready to close out now, we did mention a couple of notes there on the main event. We are in a situation on Monday Night Football. It's the Bengals, it's the Cowboys. We have Chase Brown, Shawn, and a just under 26-point lead, 25.8. We are ahead. The part that puts a little bit of fear into the system is we also are facing Ja'Marr Chase. So we've Chase Brown, Ja'Marr Chase. We did mention that we started Will Levis. So to have that lead and to have an opportunity to get a win is awesome. So we basically need Ja'Marr Chase to score less than 26 points more than Chase Brown. I don't know if that's the way that I should have said that equation, but that's what it works when you try and put it out in English. But that would be obviously awesome, Shawn, for us. But I did have a few listeners that reached out. We obviously want to win ours, but have a manager Brad who mentioned his specific one is he needs Chase Brown to outscore Dowdle by 2 points to win his FFPC Fantasy Pros League. He's up against the 1 seed. So he had a kind of similar situation to us, Shawn, in the message he sent me. He had a 5-6 regular season, got in as the second highest point, and is now ready to make that charge. So hopefully that is the case for him. I know there's a lot of similar scenarios out there, and I know a lot of people that are either waiting on both of those sides of the draw. So what I would say is hopefully Chase Brown has a big day, and then Ja'Marr Chase can go off as well. But that is going to be a tough night for the Dallas Cowboys if everyone gets theirs. But it is a very exciting time of the year when you are in these situations. I have a couple of different leagues where, it was kind of when to get in as a wild card or maybe to try and get in as a top 2 seed. Being able to sew some of those up in week 14, also awesome. I know there's a lot of listeners in a similar position, as would Shawn be in a similar position. But Monday Night Football, Shawn, I think there could be some fireworks in this, but I do expect the Bengals to win against the Cowboys pretty convincingly. The Cowboys have been very bad against the run, but a bit like we talked about with the Falcons game earlier, they have been pretty bad defensively in all facets of the game. So wishing the listeners and ourselves all the best on Monday Night Football here.
It should be a fun game. And this one is going to give you that sort of heart-stopping anxiety all day long because so many points could be scored. Colm got a 34-point lead in one of the main events with T. Higgins to go against me. It's not likely. You think about how many points that is. That would be the Puka Nacua game essentially without the rushing touchdown, which did seem a bit egregious from Sean McVay. Just kidding. You should get the ball to your best players. Those 40
We
point
will
games
talk about that, Shawn.
Very
We'll
fun.
talk about that on the second show of the week. But I had
Ben and I
about the jet sweep, but we'll talk about that later.
Well, it's so a preview. Again, if you're going to give Josh Allen the MVP, then Sean McDermott has to be fired. 44 points, and you can't defend a jet sweep that they just ran the other direction before they call timeout. Colm, Ben and I need 38 points from Ja'Marr Chase, which means I want to see that 70-yard Chase Brown touchdown run to start this game so you and I can breathe easy and the rooting interest can flip to Ja'Marr Chase. I'm predicting 40 for Chase, 20 for Chase Brown tonight. An OT victory, a Stealing Bananas victory. Come, the listeners know how well my enthusiastic Monday Night Football predictions go, so I don't think they'll be too concerned about that. As you mentioned, good luck to everybody. This has been such a fun season, such a fun week, even without Brock Bowers scoring, which was obviously sad, even with the Bucky Irving injury, which was obviously devastating. 2024 has been so much fun. Good luck tonight. Win your leagues. We're rooting for you. We love you guys.
And we will finish it up there. Shawn obviously likes to give really bold predictions, so we're looking forward to the 2-touchdown Yoshi-Vash game here on Monday Night Football to close things out and to get Ezekiel Elliott into the end zone as well. So we'll see what happens here for that one. Good luck tonight. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMarlin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out his work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.